I sat in the corner of the crowded cafe, half listening to the hum of muted conversations around me. My usual post-work coffee break was my one solace before heading home, but today, something felt off. The barista smiled as she handed me my order, but even her cheer couldn't shake the unease prickling at the back of my mind. Perhaps it was fate or cruel irony that led me to overhear that conversation. My phone buzzed with an email notification as I lifted my cup. As I scanned through work updates, a voice I knew too well floated through the air behind me. My wife's voice. Jenna. She was seated in one of the booths, just a few feet away, her tone low but animated. Curiosity tethered me to my seat. Jenna often worked late, so what was she doing here? And then I heard his voice. The man spoke with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. So, when do you plan to tell him? I froze, my coffee cup hovering midair. Every muscle in my body tightened as Jenna's reply came like a dagger to my chest. Not yet, she said with a soft laugh, the one I thought was reserved for me. First, I'll drain all his savings and hide the money. Then I'll divorce him, we'll split the house, and we can buy a new one for us. For a moment, I thought I misheard. Surely I couldn't have just overheard my wife plotting to dismantle our life together. But, as the seconds stretched, her next words sealed my disbelief into stone. I mean, he's too trusting. He won't even see it coming. The lover chuckled darkly, and I could hear the sound of his chair creaking as he leaned closer. Just make sure you're careful. The last thing we need is him catching on. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My world narrowed to the sound of their voices. My mind a whirlwind of betrayal, anger, and disbelief. Everything about our relationship, the late-night talks, the weekends spent renovating our house, her warm smile, now felt like a well-rehearsed act. And here she was, scheming to ruin me for a future with someone else. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Silently, I rose from my seat and left the cafe, my coffee untouched. It wasn't cowardice that held me back. It was the cold, calculated need for revenge. Jenna had planned to destroy me, to strip me of everything I held dear, but she had underestimated me. That night, I barely slept. While Jenna slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every red flag I'd ignored over the years. The sudden enthusiasm for taking over our finances. The way she pushed me to refinance the house in both our names. Her insistence on me closing my separate savings account to make things simpler. I contacted my lawyer the next morning, masking my fury under a calm facade. Michael, I said after explaining the situation, I want her out. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. He listened intently, nodding as I outlined everything I knew and suspected. Jenna's financial manipulations had to leave a paper trail, and Michael assured me he'd find it. Over the next week, I quietly moved money out of our joint accounts and into a new, secret account. I made copies of every financial record, every email, and every text I could find that hinted at her schemes. The storm came a month later. Jenna returned home one evening to find me sitting at the dining table, a glass of whiskey in hand. She gave me a curious smile as she set her purse down, her keys jingling against the counter. You're home early, she said, her voice light. Everything okay? Sit down, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with unease before she complied. What's this about? She asked, crossing her arms defensively. I slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were the records Michael had uncovered, hidden bank transfers to an account I didn't recognize, her signature on a fraudulent loan application in my name, and receipts for expensive gifts she'd bought, gifts I'd never seen. Her face went pale as she flipped through the papers. I know about him, I said quietly. I know about your plan, to drain me dry and leave me with nothing. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her expression hardened, and she leaned back in her chair with a shrug. So what? Maybe I deserve better than this boring life with you. You think you're so perfect, but you've been blind for years. Her coldness stunned me, but I didn't let it show. You're right, I said, standing. I was blind, but not anymore. I walked to the front door and opened it. Two police officers stepped inside. Jenna Martin, one of them said, "You're under arrest for financial fraud." Her face twisted in shock. "What the hell is this? You can't do this to me." "Actually," I said, watching as the officers cuffed her, "I can. The house? It's in my name now. And the savings you thought you were draining? That account's been empty for weeks." Her screams echoed through the hall as they led her away. The divorce was swift and merciless. With the evidence my lawyer had gathered, the court sided with me. Jenna got nothing. No house, no money, no alimony. She tried to plead with me to apologize, but it was too late. A few months later, I learned she had fled the city with her lover, living out of motels and working odd jobs to stay afloat. As for me, I rebuilt my life, stronger and smarter than before. The betrayal stung, but in the end, it was a lesson I wouldn't forget. Some say revenge is a dish best served cold. Personally, I found it tasted just fine, served with the warm satisfaction of justice. Months passed, and I rebuilt my life brick by brick. Or so I thought. Jenna's betrayal had left scars, but I told myself I'd moved on. My mornings were quiet, my nights restful, until the day her shadow returned to haunt me. It started with a phone call. "Mr. Hayes," my lawyer's voice sounded uneasy on the other end of the line. "I've received some troubling news. Jenna, she's filed a countersuit." "A what?" I spat, gripping the phone so tightly it creaked. "She claims you orchestrated the fraud to frame her," Michael said, his words deliberate and careful. "She's alleging emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and falsification of evidence." For a moment, the world spun. This had to be a sick joke. But as Michael outlined the details, I realized Jenna's scheming hadn't ended with her arrest. She was weaponizing the court system to claw her way back into my life and to bleed me dry in the process. Days later, I found myself standing outside the courthouse, the weight of the impending hearing pressing against my chest. Jenna was already inside, her lover at her side, a wiry, sharp-eyed man with a smug expression that made my blood boil. They looked untouchable, their confidence a slap in the face, but I wasn't unprepared. My lawyer had warned me that this trial would be a battle, but what neither of us anticipated was how far Jenna was willing to go. On the stand, she spun a web of lies so intricate that I could almost feel the jury's suspicion shifting toward me. "He controlled everything," she said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "The money, the house. He even cut me off from my friends. And when I tried to leave, he threatened me." Her lover played his role perfectly, standing as her witness and corroborating every lie. I sat in silence, seething, as the courtroom murmured. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about destroying me completely. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't let Jenna and her lover walk away unscathed. Justice, the kind that courtrooms couldn't provide, would be mine. I followed them. The pair left the courthouse in high spirits, laughing as they climbed into a sleek black car. I kept my distance, tailing them through the city streets. They didn't notice the nondescript sedan behind them as they pulled into a dimly lit parking garage. I waited until the echoes of their laughter faded into the concrete structure. Then, I stepped out. My footsteps echoed as I approached, the sound sharp and deliberate. Jenna turned first, her face twisting into a sneer when she saw me. "What the hell do you want, Mark?" she spat. Her lover stepped forward, his stance casual, but his eyes narrowing. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here." I smiled coldly. "I just wanted to congratulate you. That performance in court? Oscar-worthy." "Get lost," the man said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're done." "Am I?" I took another step forward, my hand slipping into my jacket. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the ones who should be worried." He scoffed, but the sound died in his throat when I pulled out the tire iron. The metal gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights. "Whoa, whoa," he said, raising his hands. "Let's not do anything stupid." "Stupid," I echoed, advancing on him. "Like draining someone's savings? Like plotting to destroy their life?" Jenna stepped back, her smug facade cracking. Mark, stop! This is crazy! You know what's crazy? I growled. Trusting you. The lover lunged, but he underestimated me. I sidestepped his clumsy attack and swung the tire iron. The satisfying crunch of metal against bone reverberated through the garage as he collapsed to the ground, clutching his knee and howling in pain. Jenna screamed, backing away as I turned toward her. Please, she begged, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean it. It was all him. He made me do it. Save it, I said, my voice cold. You've already played your part. Before she could run, I grabbed her wrist, forcing her to look at me. You think you can destroy people and walk away unscathed? Not this time. I let her go, watching as she stumbled backward, her expression a mix of fear and fury. You're insane, she hissed. You'll pay for this. Maybe, and I said, stepping over her whimpering lover. But not today. I left the garage, my hands trembling from the adrenaline. By the time I reached my car, sirens wailed in the distance. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, I felt a grim satisfaction. Jenna wanted to play games, but she forgot one crucial thing. I was no longer the trusting husband she could manipulate. I was something much worse. The fallout came quickly. The attack in the parking garage was headline news by morning. Jenna and her lover, identified in the reports as Evan Brooks, a low-level grifter with a record of petty fraud, were plastered across every local station. The footage of Evan being wheeled into the hospital, his leg encased in a splint, was particularly satisfying. Jenna's teary plea for sympathy was less so. He's dangerous, she sobbed on camera. I was just trying to escape an abusive relationship. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh, almost. The police came for me that afternoon. 2 officers in crisp uniforms knocked on my door. I didn't resist. There was no point. As they cuffed me, I glanced at Michael, who stood in my driveway, grim-faced. You'll fix this, I told him. I'll try, he said, his tone heavy with doubt. The holding cell was bleak. Cold metal benches and the smell of stale sweat. I sat in silence, ignoring the other detainees. The rage that had burned so brightly the night before had dimmed, leaving a bitter exhaustion in its place. Michael arrived hours later, his face a mask of forced neutrality. They've charged you with assault and battery, he said, sitting across from me. Evan's pressing charges, and Jenna's testimony isn't helping. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. What's the worst-case scenario? 5 years, maybe more, if they push for aggravated assault. I nodded, my jaw tightening. And the best case? Michael hesitated. We can argue provocation. With everything she's done, we might get a lenient judge. Might. I tasted the word like poison. The trial was swift. Jenna played the victim perfectly, her doe-eyed expressions and trembling voice eliciting sympathetic murmurs from the jury. Evan hobbled into the courtroom on crutches, his face pale and drawn, painting me as a violent maniac who attacked him unprovoked. Michael did his best to dismantle their narrative, presenting the financial evidence we'd gathered against Jenna. He painted her as a manipulative schemer, highlighting the fraud and lies she'd used to set her plans in motion. But the physical evidence of my retaliation, Evan's injuries, the weapon, was impossible to ignore. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty. The judge, however, took pity. Or perhaps she recognized the injustice simmering beneath the surface. Instead of prison, I received a suspended sentence, community service, and a fine. It wasn't ideal, but it was a far cry from what Jenna and Evan had hoped for. But they didn't stop there. Jenna filed a civil suit, demanding compensation for emotional distress and Evan's medical expenses. The court froze my assets during the proceedings, leaving me scrambling to cover basic expenses. My house, my sanctuary, was placed under review for liquidation. The walls were closing in. They wanted to crush me completely. And for a while, it seemed like they would. It was a chance encounter that changed everything. I ran into an old friend, David, at a local bar. He was the kind of man who thrived in shadows, his connections vast and often unsavory. We'd lost touch over the years, but when he heard my story, his grin was anything but friendly. You want this fixed? He asked, swirling his drink lazily. Because I know people. What kind of people? I asked warily. The kind who don't leave loose ends. I hesitated for weeks, wrestling with the morality of what David was offering. But as Jenna and Evan tightened their grip, dragging me through court hearings and bleeding me of every resource, my resolve hardened. One night, I called David. I'm in, I said, my voice steady. The plan was swift and ruthless. David's people dug into Jenna and Evan's lives, uncovering every dirty secret they'd tried to bury. Evan, it turned out, was wanted in 2 other states for fraud and assault. Jenna's name was tied to offshore accounts, brimming with stolen money. They were sloppy, arrogant, and completely unprepared for the storm coming their way. The first blow came when Evan was arrested at a courthouse hearing. The charges were unrelated to me. David's team had anonymously tipped off authorities about his other crimes. Jenna's screams as they hauled him away echoed through the hall, a symphony of poetic justice. The second blow came days later. The offshore accounts were leaked to the media, along with evidence of Jenna's role in laundering money. Reporters swarmed her home demanding answers. Her lawyer dropped her case within hours. By the end of the week, Jenna was a pariah, her reputation shattered. The civil suit was dismissed, her claims deemed frivolous. I walked out of the courthouse a free man, but I wasn't done. The final act came late one night. Jenna returned to her empty home, the shadows long and foreboding. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the floor, and froze. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, pictures shattered, and on the wall, scrawled in red spray paint, were the words, "You reap what you sow." She called the police, but they found nothing, no prints, no evidence, just the lingering promise that someone was watching. I sat in my new apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand, as the news played on the television. Jenna's face appeared pale and gaunt as she declined to comment on her fall from grace. Justice, I realized, wasn't always about the law. Sometimes it was about balance. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace. Months of silence followed Jenna's fall. I should have been content. She was publicly humiliated, penniless, and alone. Evan had been sentenced to a long prison term, and Jenna was barely scraping by, bouncing between cheap motels and temp jobs. But the satisfaction faded too quickly, leaving a gnawing emptiness in its wake. Her betrayal had gutted me, but her audacity to continue her schemes even after being exposed, that kept me awake at night. I wanted more than justice. I wanted destruction, a reckoning so complete that it would leave her irreparably shattered. So, I began planning. It started with the research. Every thread of her remaining life, every fragile connection she had managed to rebuild, I unraveled it all with meticulous care. She had a new job working as a receptionist at a struggling law firm. I sent them anonymous tips about her history with fraud, backed up with conveniently timed leaks of court documents. Within a week, she was fired. Jenna tried to set up a freelance business online, offering virtual assistant services. I created fake accounts, hired her for bogus jobs, and flooded her with requests, only to ghost her after days of demanding labor. She'd spend hours completing work she'd never be paid for, her reputation sinking as false complaints rolled in. But this wasn't enough. I needed her to feel fear. Late one night, I hacked into her email account. It wasn't hard. Jenna had always been lazy with passwords, reusing the same combinations for years. Once inside, I found her small circle of contacts, acquaintances who still tolerated her despite her tarnished name. I drafted carefully worded emails to each of them, pretending to be Jenna. I need to borrow money, just until I can get back on my feet. The responses were hesitant but polite, vague refusals, offers of sympathy, but little else. Her final threads of support snapped as I continued the ruse, escalating to desperate accusatory messages. Soon, they blocked her completely. Her world was shrinking, and she didn't even know I was behind it. The climax of my revenge required patience. I saved it for her last shred of stability, her lover's betrayal. Evan's incarceration had left her clinging to the hope of his release. In letters, she wrote to him about starting over, about waiting for him. She was delusional, imagining a future that would never come. I made sure of it. Through another of David's contacts, I arranged for a message to reach Evan in prison. The note painted Jenna as disloyal, detailing her supposed fling with another man during his trial. Included were fabricated photos, artfully doctored but believable, showing Jenna with a man in an intimate pose. The rage this sparked was immediate. The next time Jenna visited Evan, he refused to see her. She waited for hours, begging the guards to let her in, her desperation visible in the grainy security footage I obtained later. When Evan finally wrote back, it was a single line: "We're done. Don't contact me again." Her unraveling was glorious to watch. I rented an apartment across the street from her dingy motel, equipping it with a high-powered lens. Through the blinds, I observed as she descended into chaos. Days passed where she didn't leave her room. Takeout containers piled up outside her door, and when she did appear, her once pristine appearance was a shadow of itself. Hair unkempt, clothes wrinkled, her movements sluggish. I started sending her packages. The first was innocuous, an empty box with no return address. The second contained shredded copies of the photos I'd sent to Evan. By the third package, a single black rose with a note that read, "Still watching?" She had called the police. I watched as they arrived, their flashing lights illuminating her tiny window. But what could she say? She had no proof, no leads, just an overwhelming sense that someone, somewhere, wanted her life to be over. She wasn't wrong. The final act came 6 months later. Jenna had scraped together what little she had left to move out of the motel, finding a room in a rundown boarding house on the outskirts of town. She thought she'd escaped. She hadn't. One night, I waited until the boarding house was quiet. I broke into the building, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. It wasn't difficult to find her room. She was the only tenant who still used her full name on the mailbox. I left a USB drive on her nightstand, positioned just so she couldn't miss it. Then I disappeared into the night. The next morning, I watched from a nearby cafe as she staggered outside, the USB clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously as if she expected someone to jump out of the shadows. I imagined her reaction to what she'd seen on the drive. The complete dossier of her life laid bare. Every lie, every failure, every secret, documented and preserved, along with a chilling message at the end of the slideshow. "You ruined my life. Now I'll ruin yours. Every step, every breath, I'll be there, watching, waiting. There's no escape." It was a lie, of course. I had no intention of pursuing her beyond this, but she didn't know that. Weeks later, I heard through David that Jenna had checked herself into a psychiatric hospital. Paranoia, they said. Anxiety-induced delusions. She claimed someone was following her, destroying her life piece by piece. The doctors didn't believe her. Why would they? As I sipped my coffee that morning, I allowed myself a rare smile. Jenna had once plotted to leave me penniless and broken, to carve out her happiness from my misery. Now she had nothing but shadows for company. The fall of Jenna was only the beginning. While her life spiraled into paranoia and ruin, I turned my attention to the people who had stood by her side through it all: her family, the enablers, the ones who nodded, smiled, and ignored the truth when it suited them. If Jenna thought her suffering would end with her, she was wrong. I had more scores to settle, and her family would soon learn what it meant to cross me. It started with her parents, Richard and Diane. They had always treated me like an outsider, looking down on me with their subtle condescension, their polite dismissal of anything I ever did for Jenna. When everything went public, the fraud, the court battles, Jenna's arrest, they defended her, not me. They had called me vindictive, saying I'd overreacted, as if protecting myself from their daughter's schemes was a moral failing. Richard owned a small chain of car dealerships, the kind of business that relied on reputation and community trust. I made it my mission to obliterate both. Through David's network, I learned that Richard had been skirting the edges of legality for years, rolling back odometers, cutting corners on inspections, and bribing regulators to overlook safety violations. It was all so neatly packaged for me that I almost laughed. The first strike was anonymous tips to local news stations, a whistleblower's email, detailing the shady practices with copies of falsified records attached. Within days, reporters were camping outside his office, shoving microphones in his face, asking questions he couldn't answer. Customers canceled orders. Lawsuits followed. By the end of the month, Richard had shut down 3 of his 6 dealerships, claiming it was temporary restructuring. But we both knew it was the beginning of the end. Diane was a softer target. She had built her identity around her reputation as a respected philanthropist in the community. Charity luncheons, fundraisers, speeches about family values. All of it carefully crafted to make her appear untouchable. It only took a few well-placed rumors to undo her. I hired actors to pose as disgruntled employees of the nonprofit Diane chaired. They leaked stories to local papers about financial mismanagement, favoritism, and embezzlement. The scandal spread like wildfire. Diane's face was plastered across headlines, her carefully cultivated image in tatters. When I saw her on the news, tearfully denying the allegations, I felt nothing. She had stood by Jenna as she tried to destroy me. Now she was learning the cost of that loyalty. Jenna's brother Connor had always been a smug, arrogant prick, a wannabe tech entrepreneur with a startup that barely existed outside of his LinkedIn profile. He was Jenna's confidant, the one who encouraged her to go through with her schemes against me. Connor's downfall was almost too easy. A few forged emails, carefully planted in his company's records, were all it took. Emails that implicated him in a fake cryptocurrency scam, painting him as the mastermind of a Ponzi scheme. When federal investigators came knocking, Connor's bravado crumbled. His investors pulled out overnight, leaving him with mounting debts and no way to cover them. I made sure he knew who was behind it. A simple letter mailed to his home with a single line: "Some betrayals can't be forgiven." Jenna's younger sister, Claire, was the only one I hesitated to target. She had been relatively uninvolved in the chaos, but her silence during Jenna's trial spoke volumes. Claire worked as a social media influencer, building her brand on authenticity and trust. She'd posted videos defending Jenna, painting me as a monster. Her downfall was spectacular. David's team hacked her accounts, unearthing a treasure trove of incriminating messages, racist jokes, backstabbing gossip about friends, and even a few conversations mocking her own followers. We leaked the messages one by one, strategically timed to maximize outrage. Claire's sponsors dropped her within days. Her follower count plummeted. By the end of the month, her career was in ruins. The final act came when I sent Jenna's family a package. Inside were photos of each of their ruined lives: Richard standing in front of his shuttered dealerships, Diane weeping as reporters hounded her outside her home, Connor in handcuffs, and Claire's empty social media profile. The note inside was simple: "You made me your enemy." Now you know what that means. Months later, as I sat in a quiet cafe, I overheard 2 women discussing Jenna's family. They whispered about how cursed they seemed, how everything had fallen apart for them all at once. I sipped my coffee and smiled to myself. Sometimes revenge wasn't about a single act. It was about dismantling an entire legacy, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but ashes. Jenna's family wasn't just broken, they were obliterated. Each member now carried their own personal ruin, bound together by the silent understanding that they had been targeted. They didn't speak of it publicly. What could they say? Admitting they were victims would only invite questions they couldn't answer. But for me, this wasn't over. Not yet. There was one final move to make. A way to ensure that the name Martin would forever be synonymous with failure and disgrace. It was time to erase whatever shreds of their legacy remained. Jenna's parents had once been the cornerstone of their town's social circle. Richard had built his dealership empire from scratch. Diane had spent decades cultivating an image of elegance and integrity. Their friends were affluent, their connections vast. It was through those connections that they survived the first waves of destruction. I needed to sever those lifelines. Step 1 was financial. Richard's dealerships were already crumbling. but I ensured the final nail in the coffin. Through David, I arranged a clandestine meeting with one of his top competitors. I handed over detailed documents exposing every shady practice Richard had ever employed, things that even the media hadn't uncovered yet. The competitor acted quickly, filing lawsuits and pressuring Richard's remaining clients to jump ship. The legal fees alone were enough to bury him. Within weeks, Richard declared bankruptcy, his reputation as a savvy businessman permanently tarnished. Step 2 was social. Diane's fall from grace as a philanthropist had left her isolated, but she still clung to a few close friends, other wealthy wives who sympathized with her plight. I dug into each of their lives, finding weaknesses, secrets, anything I could exploit. I started with subtle sabotage, anonymous letters, carefully worded to spark paranoia and distrust. One friend received photos of Diane leaving a meeting with a known scam artist, a meeting I had staged, complete with hired actors. Another received fabricated texts that suggested Diane had been gossiping behind her back. The cracks formed quickly. Diane was quietly but decisively pushed out of her social circle, leaving her utterly alone. Connor, Jenna's brother, was next. His financial ruin had left him desperate, and desperation made him sloppy. He tried to rebuild his reputation by pitching a new startup idea to potential investors, hoping to regain some credibility. I made sure those investors received anonymous warnings about his fraudulent past. I even had David's team impersonate a few investors, stringing him along with promises of funding, only to pull out at the last minute. Each rejection chipped away at his hope until he stopped trying altogether. When I learned he'd started working a low-level tech support job, I sent an email to his boss, posing as a former colleague. The email detailed his history of unethical behavior and suggested he wasn't to be trusted with sensitive company data. He was fired the next day. Claire, the influencer, had fallen the hardest. After her career collapsed, she attempted to rebrand herself as a mental health advocate, using her struggles as a marketing angle. It was laughable, really, a privileged brat trying to play the victim. I destroyed her credibility with a single move. David's team created a fake nonprofit, supposedly dedicated to mental health awareness, and invited Claire to partner with them. She eagerly accepted, promoting the organization across her dwindling platforms. For weeks, she poured what little money and influence she had left into the project. Then, we revealed the truth. The nonprofit was a sham. Publicly exposed as a liar and a fraud, again, Claire became the laughingstock of the internet. This time, there was no coming back. Finally, there was Jenna. While her family crumbled around her, she remained in the psychiatric hospital, her mind fractured by paranoia. But even there, I found ways to remind her that she would never escape me. Through carefully placed bribes, I ensured she received letters and packages, seemingly from nowhere. Each one contained subtle reminders of her past, copies of our old wedding photos with my face scratched out, fake court documents ordering her to repay non-existent debts, and cryptic notes that read, "Still watching." One package contained a mirror, shattered into pieces. Inside was a note, "This is all that's left of you." Her breakdowns became more frequent. The doctors were baffled, unable to understand why she wasn't improving. I knew why. She couldn't heal, not while I held the strings. Months later, I learned that Jenna's parents had sold their house, moving to a tiny apartment far from the life they once knew. Connor had left town entirely, his name now synonymous with failure in the tech community. Claire had vanished from social media, her accounts deleted, her reputation unsalvageable. And Jenna? She remained in that hospital, a ghost of the woman she once was. The Martins were finished. Their name, their legacy, their future, all of it was gone. I stood in the ruins of what they had built, the architect of their destruction, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Some would call this overkill, but I called it balance. The Martins were annihilated, reduced to shadows of their former selves. But as much as their destruction satisfied me, a part of me still felt unfinished. Their collapse had been deliberate and complete. but it hadn't erased the years I'd spent as their victim. I had taken everything from them, yes, but I wanted to leave behind something deeper, something that would linger for generations. A legacy of fear, a reminder to the world that I was not a man to cross. My final move began quietly, with whispers in the places Jenna's family had tried to rebuild. The Martins may have been ruined, but remnants of their existence lingered. Old friends who still spoke of their bad luck, faint traces of their name tied to forgotten projects, and even a few sympathizers who pitied their downfall. I couldn't allow that pity to blossom into redemption. The Martins would not be remembered as victims of misfortune. They would be remembered as villains, their names synonymous with failure and disgrace. I hired David's team to create a digital archive, a detailed repository of every misdeed, every scandal, every shameful moment tied to the Martins. Jenna's fraudulent schemes, Richard's dealership crimes, Diane's fake philanthropy, Connor's failed scams, Claire's humiliations, everything was there, meticulously cataloged. The archive was launched as a website, complete with public documents, photos, and timelines. It was anonymous, of course, but the design left no doubt about its purpose: the Martin Family Expose. I leaked it to every journalist, every gossip site, every blogger with a taste for scandal. The site went viral within days. News outlets picked up the story, rehashing the Martins' disgrace with fresh enthusiasm. People devoured the details, dissecting their downfall with cruel fascination. Memes and jokes flooded social media, their name reduced to a punchline. Richard tried to fight back. He attempted to sue for defamation, claiming the site was a smear campaign. But the evidence was undeniable. Every document, every photo, every claim was backed by hard proof. His lawsuit was thrown out, leaving him humiliated and deeper in debt. Diane withdrew completely, retreating to a life of obscurity. Her attempts to regain a foothold in society were met with whispers and pointed stares. Even charity events, the last refuge of the disgraced, closed their doors to her. Connor and Claire vanished entirely. The internet never forgets, and every time they tried to rebuild, the archive resurfaced, dragging them back into the spotlight of ridicule. They became pariahs, unable to escape the weight of their name. And Jenna? She was already broken, her mind shattered beyond repair. But I couldn't resist one last touch. I sent her a letter, delivered by an orderly who owed me a favor. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed with the URL to the Martin Family Expose and one line written beneath it: "This is how the world will remember you." When she saw it, she screamed. Her breakdown was so severe that they moved her to a higher security wing, isolating her from the few comforts she had left. Years passed, and the Martins faded into obscurity, their names spoken only in hushed tones or as a cautionary tale. The house they had once considered their family home was sold off and left to decay, a crumbling relic of their former life. Their legacy was not one of success or redemption, but of infamy. As for me, I moved on. Slowly, deliberately, I rebuilt my own life. Not as the man I had been before Jenna's betrayal, but as something new, stronger, unrelenting, unforgiving. I never told anyone the full extent of what I'd done. To the outside world, I was just another man who had survived heartbreak and emerged stronger. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had created something enduring, a monument to vengeance so complete that no one would ever dare cross me again. And that was enough.